Are your quads feeling tight? Even though it can be really tempting to just focus on trying to relax and loosen up the quads, there may be a lot more going on under the surface. And on this week's episode of the Exercises Health Podcast, we want to highlight for you some of those things that may be going on. We're going to cue our introduction and we're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health Podcast, brought to you by Muscle Activation Schaumburg and Exercise for Life Studios, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We're your hosts, Charlie
and Julie.
And today we are talking about the quads, all right? These muscles live on the front of your thighs, and they are a very common muscle that people think about working when they go to work out. They're also a very common muscle that a lot of people experience issues with, especially from a tightness perspective. So if that's you, if you are feeling your quads are tight, no matter what you do for them, no matter how you try to stretch them or release them or relax them or roll them or whatever else you're trying to do with them, we have some insights that are going to be very valuable for you to hear, because there's a lot more that goes on within your body versus just like, oh, this area is tight and so this area needs to relax. And we want to walk you through a lot of how we think about different symptoms, or specifically quad tightness. When somebody would come in and say, hey, my quads are feeling really tight, these are some of the things that would go through our head.
That's right. So to jump off of that, Charlie, when we're thinking about, or when someone is telling us about having a certain area that's tight, like their quads are really tight, we're always asking the question, well, why? Mm-hmm. We don't treat tightness like a mistake, like something that needs to get removed. Although it is very uncomfortable, it might be annoying to you, or maybe you've just accepted it as your norm. We understand that, hey, the body puts tight stuff wherever it puts tight stuff for a reason. Meaning it's there to either protect you or as a response from someone else. And honestly, tightness is your body's best solution right now. And what we try to do is potentially offer alternative solutions, especially if that tightness is bothering you, your quad tightness is really annoying you or stopping you from doing the things you want. But I think before we jump into some of the things that we might think through, let's talk about what the quads are. I think a lot of times we think about, we just kind of grab the front of our thigh and we're like, this is the quad, right? So your quad actually controls more than just the front of your thigh. Every muscle in your body has to cross a joint. And the joints that the quad crosses and thus controls is it crosses the front of your hip, but it also crosses the knee. So a lot of times we think about it as like, the knee straighteners, or it straightens out your knee, or you think about working quads at the gym, it's like bending and then straightening your knee. But it also is a hip muscle. And so when we're thinking about, okay, how can we problem solve around this tightness that you're experiencing, that's through the MAT lens or the muscle function lens. We're thinking, okay, well, we know it's a hip muscle, so it's got a strong influence over the hip. We know it's also a knee muscle. It's got a strong influence over that knee, and then we can start problem solving from there.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, we did a podcast about the difference between the knee and the patellofemoral joint. The quad also influences the patellofemoral joint. Yes. So there's 3 different joints that it can directly influence, and far more than what is often considered when thinking about quad stuff. And so the other kind of misnomer or misunderstanding that is very common about the quads is the idea that, oh, there's just 4 muscles, hence the name quads, okay? And so there's actually 11 different muscles that make up the quads, okay? And with muscle activation techniques, we have the ability to assess and test each and every one of those 11 different divisions. And why this is so important is because it allows you to get way more dialed in with not only the thinking, but in the thought process, but how you go about actually addressing potential quad issues. Because the reality is the tightness that is going on with the quad. The first thing, it might actually be a quad issue, all right? Meaning like there might actually be some dysfunction or some inhibition from a muscle perspective going on with your quads. Like I said, there's 11 different divisions that we can assess and test with muscle activation techniques, 11 different muscles that help to extend the knee. And so with that, like it could be that, one of those 11 is not functioning well. It could be that 11 of the 11 are not functioning well, right? And so if we just kind of group it all together as like, oh, it's my quad that is the issue, and put all 11 under the same umbrella, well, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of detail that ends up being missed. And so understanding that, yeah, there may be actually some inhibited muscles, there may be some dysfunctional muscles within the quadriceps group, but there are 11 potential options within the quadriceps group of different muscles that should be assessed and then potentially addressed.
Right, and if you're having tightness in your quad and you are having a quad issue, you might even strengthen quads when you go to the gym. You might do the knee extension when you go to the gym. But what we know is that our body is like the master of compensation. And our bodies are going to compensate even when our brains are not aware. Right, we've all limped before and we're like, yeah, I'm compensating because clearly I'm limping. But we still compensate even when you're not like limping and you're not overly aware that it's happening. Your compensation might, show up or tell your brain that you're compensating because of some tightness there. So with MAT, what we're looking for is what muscles here are inhibited, meaning they're not connected as well to the nervous system, so they're not firing as well as they could be. And what we find is that when we get rid of this inhibition and we work on this inhibition and restore muscles to normal neuromuscular connectivity, then things are firing better, things are stronger, but also that nagging symptom of tightness will generally go away because now your body's not having to be tight because it's not having to protect as much. Usually tightness is a result of the inhibition or the weakness.
Exactly. So yes, the tightness that you're feeling in your quads may be actually a quad issue, but it also might be a hamstring issue, okay? One thing that we see time and again with muscle activation techniques is that when muscles on one side of the body are inhibited or dysfunctional, muscles on the opposite side of the body tighten up in response. They tighten up in order to limit motion intentionally, in order to try to protect the joints and really kind of protect your system overall from doing too much with a system that is compromised. And so in this case, if your quads are feeling really tight, it very well may be that it's your hamstrings that are weak, inhibited, dysfunctional. And by working through all the different divisions of the hamstrings, all the different hamstring muscles, getting those muscles functioning better, that may allow the tightness that you're experiencing in your quad to calm down as well. And that's often what we see with MAT. When you're able to address the inhibition, when you're able to address the weakness through the MAT process, that is when the tightness just naturally goes away on its own.
A lot of times weakness, like what Charlie is saying, we see that as an inability to contract or get really short. So if your issue is stemming from a hamstring inhibition or a hamstring issue, then what your body will do is not be able to contract the hamstrings very well. And so your body's natural stopper from you bending your knee or from you putting your hamstrings in a really vulnerable place is to set up tightness, and specifically in the quads. And so this is actually a really strategic plan that our nervous system does. It's like, whoa, the hamstrings aren't working, so let's make the quads get tighter so that it is stopping this person from using the hamstrings like that, because we already know the hamstrings won't be able to tolerate it. There's too much inhibition. There's too much weakness in the area. So what happens is that once we return normal muscle function into those hamstrings, or we work on getting it back up to baseline, then that quad tightness naturally goes away, because now the nervous system is realizing, hey, we don't have to protect these muscles anymore because they're holding their own. They're strong. They're functional. They're able to handle motion, as opposed to, okay, we have to be tight because they can't handle motion. So your tightness in your quads might be intentionally placed there because of weakness or inhibition in those hamstrings.
That's exactly right. Now, the third thing that we likely consider is what's going on with the hip. All right, there may actually be some issues going on with the hip. And for the sake of brevity, we're going to limit this discussion to the hip flexors and the glutes. The hip flexors being the muscles on the front side of the hip, or the muscles that help to lift the leg up, and the glutes being your butt, the muscles on the back side of the hip that help to extend the hip or bring your leg behind you, okay? And both of these have a direct tie to the quadriceps, where, like Julie was saying earlier, your quadriceps also help to control your hip, all right? And they will help to flex the hip or lift the leg up, all right? And so if those hip flexors, those other hip flexors aren't working well or dysfunctional, aren't able to do their job, then the quads may have to overwork to compensate for the weakness in the dysfunction within the other hip flexors, and then the quads start feeling tight as a response. Likewise with the glutes, all right, there's this concept called triple extension, okay, which means at your hip and your knee and your ankle, there says you're extending, okay, or it's technically plantar flexion at the ankle, but point being is when you kind of extend your hip, you oftentimes also extend your knee. Think about when you're walking and your leg goes behind you, your knee's not bent when your leg goes behind you. You're kind of pushing yourself forward, your leg goes behind you, and your knee straightens, okay? And so there is this synergistic relationship between the glutes and the quads, such that if your glutes aren't working, in order to keep you propelling yourself forward, in order to allow you to continue to walk and run and stand upright and everything like that, your quads may have to overwork for weakness or dysfunction within the glutes.
I remember I specifically had this issue with hip flexion and working with tight quads. I remember at a certain point in my life, I decided to do a very intense athletic event, run a half marathon. And I remember it completely kind of overwhelmed and inhibited my hip flexors. And so for a good chunk of time until I rehabbed that hip flexor, got enough MAT, my quads were like on fire all the time because they were trying to be tight, they were protecting the hip. And so it could definitely come from a hip compensation. And so when we're thinking about, okay, how are we going to solve this tight quad thing, we're thinking, okay, we need to work on hip strength and look at the muscles that may be inhibited in throughout the hip. It could be the hip flexors, like it was in my case, but it could also be the hip extensors, like Charlie was bringing up with the glutes, muscles that bring your leg backwards. Your quads are an amazing, large, strong muscle group that is really good at protecting around that hip.
Exactly. Now, it may not be a hip issue. It may actually be lower down on your body where it may be an ankle issue, okay? So we've kind of looked at the knee directly. We've discussed the hip, but it also may be an ankle issue. And again, there's a lot of things we could consider, but in this conversation, we're going to consider pointing the foot up, which is called ankle dorsiflexion, and pointing the foot down, which is called ankle plantar flexion, the latter of which being predominantly done by your calf muscles, okay? So ankle dorsiflexion, where you're pointing the foot up, this is a motion that a lot of people are pretty limited in, where they don't have enough, or they don't have a lot of ankle dorsiflexion, and so it is uncomfortable for them to go barefoot. It's uncomfortable for them to wear flat shoes because of how much ankle dorsiflexion that forces them to be in, and then it starts to make the rest of their body feel weird. And one of the areas that can start to feel weird is if you don't have enough ankle dorsiflexion, it can cause your knees to start to pick up more stress. And like we said, your quads are one of the predominant controllers of your knees, which means if your knees are getting stressed, your quads are going to get more stressed because you're not able to dorsiflex your ankles or point your feet up well enough. On the flip side of that, again, is pointing the foot down, all right, or ankle plantar flexion, and that's done with the kind of group of muscles called your calves, which is like your gastrocs and your soleus muscle groups. And what happens here is if those muscles aren't working well, your calf muscles aren't working well, again, this goes along with that idea of triple extension, where when you're trying to walk forward, you're trying to push yourself forward, you're trying to stand upright, you're trying to run, whatever it may be, if your feet aren't able to point down well enough, if your ankles aren't able to point down well enough because your calf muscles aren't working well, your body will try to make up for that. And that one of the ways it can do that is by causing your quads to have to overwork. So again, this can be a natural area where your quads start to tighten up if there is dysfunction or inhibition or weakness within the calf muscles.
Now, the ankles are a huge player in how the knee is going to function because it is literally the next joint below the knee. And so we know the quads are one of the main controllers of the knee. So working on that ankle motion is going to be key to figuring out if that is the cause to your quad tightness. Now, the next area is your trunk motion, specifically trunk flexion and trunk extension. Now, one thing a lot of people don't realize is your quads, again, are a hip muscle, which means that the muscles will cross the hip and attach into the pelvis. Your trunk muscles attach somewhere in the trunk a lot of them down right into the pelvis. So it is a shared area. If we have weakness or inhibition in the trunk muscles, a lot of times it will change very specifically how the hips are going to move. And this has a high influence on how the quads are feeling and functioning. So a lot of times if you're unable to flex forward or extend back, the hips will then tighten up in specific ways so that we're protecting or compensating for that lack of trunk stability. So then the quads will oftentimes take a big brunt for that, often trying just to protect you from the inhibition that may be living in your trunk.
Yeah, that's really interesting because oftentimes we see that when we are working through somebody's system with muscle activation techniques and we are doing different trunk muscles that require them to like sit vertically on the table with the legs out in front of them, and then I feel like, oh, like my quads are really tight here. It's really hard for me to have my legs straight out. And then all of a sudden, we're starting to work through their abdominals, we're working through their obliques, maybe we're working through some of their low back muscles, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can sit, not only can I sit up, but I can also straighten my legs out more. Like my quads aren't, and my hamstrings aren't feeling as tight. Like my leg muscles are actually starting to relax because my trunk muscles are functioning better and my system overall is becoming more supportive. So there is a direct tie between those areas. And again, just the idea that if there is weakness, if there is inhibition, if there is dysfunction somewhere in your body is going to naturally try to protect you from that and is going to cause other areas to have to overwork and have to tighten up. And while there may be like a very, all right, this is where the tightness is, so that's where the dysfunction is kind of relationship, oftentimes it can be much more widespread than that, where there are there's weakness or dysfunction happening in one area of the body and the symptom is showing up in a completely different area of the body anatomically. And that's a lot of times what we see with the trunk and the quads. The last area that we're going to touch on are the feet. Okay, we talked about the ankles, but with the feet, we have a couple motions in them called pronation and supination that tie directly to one of the primary things of the quads. And why this is so important is because when your feet pronate and supinate, or when your arches flatten, and then when your arches get bigger, which happens every single time you step, or should happen every single time you step, the kind of chain reaction throughout the body, the next area up is the shin bone or the tibia. And that bone has to be able to spin, which means the knee has to be able to spin or rotate. And one of the things that the quads can do around that knee joint is create the spinning of the shin bone, or what's called tibial rotation, okay? And so again, if the feet are not able to pronate or supinate well, if the arches are not able to flatten and then pop back up really well, it may be causing an issue with kind of tibial rotation, which again may be causing issues with the quads and causing them to feel tight, causing them to feel like they are being overworked or that there is some issue with the quads, when in fact it's actually an issue with the feet. So the reason why we go through this whole entire thing, while we brought up these 6 different areas, and believe me, there's more to consider than that, but we just wanted to touch on these 6 different areas and these different motions, is so you can understand that like where you're having a symptom in your body, yeah, there may actually be an issue with that area, but there's likely something going on somewhere else as well. And really, in our experience, the only way that you would know is with the muscle activation techniques process. Okay, if you're hearing all this, you're like, okay, great, like my quads are feeling really tight. How do I know if it is my quads, my hamstrings, my hips, my ankles, my trunk, my feet? Like, where do I even start? For us, step 1 is muscle activation techniques, because that entire process is going to be assessing your body as a whole, and looking at all the different individual parts, and then being able to piece together and say, okay, these are where your symptoms are. Here's where the limits in motion are. Here's where the muscle dysfunction is, and you'll be able to identify and address the inhibited or dysfunctional muscles, and then through the MAT process, actually not only strengthen the muscles, but increase your body's tolerance and stress, to increase your body's tolerance to stress for those muscles. So when you're going and living life, or you're going for a walk, or you are doing whatever it is that you want to do, it's less likely that the dysfunction returns because your body is more tolerant to the stresses that you face in your life.
That's right. So when you're jumping into the MAT process, I think it's important to remember that, hey, again, you might have an issue where you're having symptoms, like we've just said, but it might also be from somewhere else. It might also be, a dysfunction in any of the other 6 areas or any of the other 5 areas that we talked about. The reason this is so important is that if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably already tried to do a few things to relieve your tight quads. And the big thing that MAT views the body that's different than a lot of other modalities is that we view tightness as secondary, meaning we view that we know that it's there because there's something else there, and that is inhibition and weakness. And so when we address inhibition and weakness, the tightness goes away without us having to rub it or do anything to it, right? Because the body is putting it there for a reason. We take the reason away and the body will resolve that symptom that you're feeling. But until then, your body's going to try to keep putting back its protective mechanisms. Your body is designed to protect itself. And so until these inhibitions or weaknesses are taken care of, your body is going to continue to return that tightness if you are able to remove it in some way, unless that weakness or inhibition is addressed. And that's exactly what MAT does, is we look through, if you came in with tight quads, we'd look through all these areas to figure out, okay, is there muscle weakness, limits, inhibition in these areas that could be causing this tight quad issue or this tight quad solution that your body's creating? We just want to give it new solutions that feel better and more productive for you.
Absolutely, and then once your body starts functioning better with MAT, and the amount of muscle dysfunction throughout your system goes down, what we can start to do then is follow up the MAT work with specific strength training to increase the capacity of your muscles, increase your strength output, and again, just increase your ability to keep doing the things that you want to do. Always coming back and following up with the MAT to make sure that everything is still functioning well and that there's not more muscle dysfunction being created, but really making sure that the quads themselves are strong from an output perspective, making sure that the other areas of your body are strong from an output perspective, and doing that with strength training once they are functioning well through the MAT process really helps a lot of people continue to do the things in their life that bring them the most joy with fewer and fewer and fewer issues.
That's right. So connecting in this MAT and strength training together is really the powerful combination, because we want to get you functioning and muscles working properly, but then we also want to be, again, building up that tolerance, because really the end goal of keeping your body well and healthy and functioning properly and your muscles feeling good is so that you can go and do the things you want. And so to do that, we're trying to build up your system so that you're breaking down way, way less frequently.
So if you are wanting to experience MAT for yourself and you're in the Chicagoland area or willing to travel to the Chicagoland area, that is our specialty here at Muscle Activation Schaumburg. To see our availability and get on our schedule, all you have to do is go to www.matschaumburg.com. On our website, you'll see a big green button that you can click that says Get Started, and you'll immediately be taken to our scheduling system where you'll see our availability and can schedule yourself for your initial MAT consultation and assessment. And if you would like our guidance on your strength training, on workouts that you're able to do from home in under 30 minutes using minimal equipment and really follow the key principles that we talk about a lot on this podcast, which we call our Exercise for Life principles, that's exactly what we teach you to do within the Exercise for Life membership. Right now, you can get your first 30 days to the entire membership absolutely for free by going to www.exerciseforlifestudios.com. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know who always feeling that their quads are tight, that no matter what they do, no matter how much they roll out, no matter how much they stretch, their quads are always feeling tight? Share this episode with them so they can understand the complex situation that may be going on within their system and all the different things that need to be considered with something that seems as simple as quad tightness. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us and leave us a rating and review. Not only does it help people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise, it also helps them find our podcast when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.